And now I'd like to introduce today's presenters. With us is Willie Pegues IV, who is the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for McGowan Gordon Construction in Kansas City, Missouri, where he's responsible for strategic oversight of the organization's DEI efforts. He facilitates organizational change by fostering a diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment. Willie excels in leadership, communication, problem solving, and decision making. He has developed cross-functional collaborative teams to solve organizational issues and improve processes at Fortune 500 companies as well as at nonprofits. Also with us is Victor Sturgis, who is a CPA and a CCIFP. He's a tax senior manager and racial equity fellow at Crowe in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Victor advises his clients on tax issues and solutions, and he represents his firm on diversity and inclusion task forces and committees throughout the accounting profession, including here at CFMA and at the Michigan Society of CPAs. Victor earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in accounting from the University of Michigan. Also with us is Simeon Terry, who is Vice President of Diversity Affairs for Austin Commercial in Austin, Texas, and has been in the construction industry for 30 years, managing diversity programs for 2 decades. At Austin Commercial, Mr. Terry oversees the cultural competency education, diversity compliance, affirmative action, recruiting, hiring, mentoring, and business procurement diversity. In addition, he has developed strategies to maximize inclusion in the workforce diversity workspace. Mr. Terry holds a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering from Kansas State University and an MBA in finance, as well as multiple certifications in compliance. Also with us is Brittany Dietrich. Brittany is the Director of Finance, Administration, and Corporate Treasurer for Industrial Builders Incorporated and part of the 3rd generation family ownership of IBI, which is a heavy civil contractor based in West Fargo, North Dakota. As Director of Finance, Brittany manages the company's accounting, HR, payroll, contract administration, and IT departments, as well as several construction projects each year. Brittany graduated top of her class from North Dakota State University in 2015 with degrees in business administration and construction management. She is on a variety of industry boards and committees, including CFMA's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And last but not least, we have Rachel Hudson, who serves as the Performance Success Manager for BKD CPAs and Advisors in Rogers, Arkansas, where she manages the firm's performance management, engagement, and diversity inclusion initiatives. Rachel has more than 14 years of experience in human resources, focusing on talent management and organizational development. Her work in redesigning BKD's performance and engagement programs was featured in Harvard Business Review. Rachel holds a bachelor's degree in marketing from the Missouri State University and as well as numerous certifications in human resources. So there's a lot to cover in today's program, and I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, Victor Sturgis.
Sue, thank you. Thank you so much for the wonderful introductions. Welcome, everybody. As Sue said, my name is Victor Sturgis. I'm happy to be here with you today as the moderator for our esteemed panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day today to join us. You know, this group recently did a session at the CFMA National Conference called The Why Behind Diversity and Inclusion. During that session, we covered some definitions around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we touched on the business case for D&I as well. If you missed that session, there's a link in the resources section at the bottom left of your screen. Please visit that when you get a chance and watch that session. We got such positive feedback from that discussion that day, and there were so many questions that we unfortunately were not able to get to. So with that, we decided that it made sense to do a round 2. And so today we're going to try and get to some of those questions that you asked during that session, as well as some new questions that come up today. Those questions that we found were broken out into really mainly 3 different categories. 1, how do you have uncomfortable conversations, which is how do you listen? 2, how our life experiences shape our perspectives, which is in a way how you learn. And there's some learning that's about yourself, like how did my life experience change my perspective on the world today? And then 3, you know, how do you build support or become a D&I champion for your company? And that falls under the category of how you lead in this space. So these are going to be our focus points for the discussion today. But before we get started, we want to cover our rules of engagement, which were very popular during that first session. And I'll start from the beginning. We usually start our diversity, equity, and inclusion committee meetings through CFMA with these rules of engagement. The main goal is to really set the tone. We all have so many things going on. It sets the tone of the meeting, gets us in a positive space, ready to have what are usually pretty difficult and sometimes discussions that get into your feelings, right? And so we use these rules of engagement to make sure we're all centered on the discussion. So first and foremost, we assume positive intent. We engage in dialogue, not debate. Hold yourself and others accountable for demonstrating cultural humility. Be open, transparent, and willing to admit mistakes. Embrace the power of humble listening. Create trusting and safe spaces where a little bit of discomfort is okay, and we're going to talk about that more today. Commit to having conversations that matter by speaking up to bridge divides. Suspend your right to be offended. Look for an opportunity to be second, and your voice is important. Let's ensure that it's heard. We don't have a slide for that, and I'm sure there's probably going to be people that say, hey, can we get that somewhere in writing? There's going to be an amazing place to see that in writing, and that's actually in the Building Profits magazine. The November-December issue will have an article that features our rules of engagement and how we see these and how to leverage these rules as well. So keep an eye out for that. With that, let's go ahead and get started. Let's start with our first category here of listening and having uncomfortable conversations. But we want to hear from you first. Let's bring up polling question number 2. So let me read these. I know you're already answering them, but why does it feel uncomfortable to talk about diversity and inclusion at work? I'm afraid that I'm going to say the wrong things. I'm concerned about damaging work relationships. I don't think these conversations have a place in the workplace. I or others get emotional or angry. I think it's a divisive topic, or other. So let's take a look at the polling results. Okay. So it looks like 58% of folks are afraid that they're going to say the wrong thing. And my initial response to that is ingraining something like the rules of engagement in your culture helps with that, right? One of the rules is to suspend the right to be offended. So understanding that folks are coming from a positive place and suspending the right. If someone does say something that may be wrong or may be offensive to you, you suspended that right. And then you can approach that person or that topic with grace, right? Understanding that they're coming from a positive place. So let's go to our panelists now. Brittany, how do you become comfortable being uncomfortable in these conversations?
I feel like this is kind of a trick question for me, but I'm a young person, so who knows? But I think the rules of engagement are amazing. Every meeting I've had where they've started with them, as long as everyone is listening and being really sincere, the assumed positive intent is a game changer for having difficult conversations. You might say the wrong thing, but as long as you know someone else's heart is in the right space, you can make some progress. So that, given the recent context of the rules of engagement is excellent, but I becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable. I don't know if it's possible for me yet. I'm happy to speak up for things that make me uncomfortable, but I have not yet mastered learning how to not be uncomfortable. So probably not an expert there, but sometimes it's worth it. It's worth it to be a little uneasy.
I would agree with that as well. We're working through such a number of challenging topics right now, I think more so than ever before. We're talking about, diversity and inclusion, but also, COVID protocols, right? And then personal beliefs around vaccines and so many really challenging topics to navigate. And they're challenging because they touch on our core values, feeling respected, health and safety, a sense of belonging. And these are emotionally charged topics, but it doesn't mean that we should avoid having those conversations or that we can't have a crucial conversation that's not respectful or that doesn't actually deepen understanding on both sides as well. So I think it's possible, and it's important to have those crucial conversations and really lean into that experience. And I would say, as we're stepping into a challenging conversation, really first reflect on why we're feeling uncomfortable. Is it because someone else's viewpoint differs from our own? Is it because we're having our own emotional response? And I think all of that is very normal, but it's really critical to have that self-awareness before engaging in a conversation. And then finally, it's really normal to feel uncomfortable when we're learning something new. And like anything else, learning how to have a crucial conversation is a skill, and it'll feel really uncomfortable. And I would say just kind of normalize that feeling and just sort of lean into it. And it doesn't always go away, but it does become a little bit more kind of par for the course after a while.
I got like a vision of Bambi on the ice in Bambi, obviously. The first time you do it, you're going to look funny. It's going to feel weird, but you'll figure it out. You'll be a majestic deer someday.
I get it. I really understand why. Those conversations are uncomfortable, especially having these conversations at work, right? But as we all have learned over just over the past few years, our lives are there's so many intersectional pieces of our lives that just cross over. We can no longer leave our issues at the front of the door of the businesses. And where these conversations, they're relevant, they're applicable to doing our work. And like anything else, you have to practice. You have to be able to begin to lean into being able to allow yourself to be uncomfortable. And the more you do that, as Brittany and Rachel has alluded to, the more comfortable you'll get. We have to continue to challenge ourselves in order to continue and to grow and evolve. You take, whether it's a sport, a musical instrument, or any type of effort that you've never done before, you got to take practice. And I do understand that, well, I don't want to offend anyone, or I don't want to say something that they will be offended. As both of Rachel and Brittany talked about, setting those guidelines, setting those rules of engagement, where a person understands that, okay, this is what we're having the conversation about, and I'm going to assume positive intent, and I understand that you're trying to be genuine, you're trying to learn, you're trying to gain a sense of understanding. So let's have a conversation. As long as that's the approach that you take, don't worry about stumbling, because the more you stumble, the more you learn, and you become aware, and the better that you'll become of it. And you will then become more comfortable.
Great. Thanks, Billy. I think we can take that maybe a step further in talking about how you actually approach these conversations. You guys want to get to that next level and talk about how you go into someone's office or go to someone's desk or pick up the phone and call that individual, and what frame of mind you should be in when you have that conversation. Brittany, you want to start off again there?
Yes, I'd love to. So I was on LinkedIn a little while ago, and I saw a really great TED Talk about the snowball effect. And it's kind of this unspoken thing in the room, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And then all of a sudden it's gotten humongous. And you're like, gosh, I can't address this yet. It's gotten so big and it's too big to deal with. But the thing about it is, the longer you let it go, the worse it gets. So once you know in your gut that there's something that needs to be dealt with, as big as the snowball has gotten, you just gotta circle back to it. Things rarely resolve themselves in my experience. And so changes on the way that people's habits build over their entire lives. And, it takes a lot of work to undo certain like implicit bias and stuff. So you have to start somewhere and address it before any progress can be made. I'll give to someone else who has more experience on this.
Comes down to just being genuine, having a genuine approach, allowing yourself to be vulnerable in a conversation. Because you're not there to be the smartest person in the room. You're there to, again, going back to gain the understanding. You want to be there for that person because these conversations are hard, because the topics are very polarizing. And because, one little thing, one little misstep can really surface these experiences, these past experiences that people have experienced. So it's okay to admit ignorance. But again, going back to, we have to seek understanding and being genuine and vulnerable, and not being the smartest person in the room, and just being able to just let your guard down and have that conversation, even if it makes you uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think it's important, and I always use the acronym ACE, advocate, communicate, educate. Advocate your position, but do it in a manner that it's not just domineering and where it's offensive that turns people off. Communication goes both ways. And so for me, I always try to make sure that, I keep myself in a frame of mind of being receptive, regardless of how it comes from that particular person. And the educational piece allows you to have a better understanding of individuals' experiences, why they think or feel the way they do. And I think once you can do that, then you can have a real conversation versus trying to get a particular point across or some type of compliance component. It's very important to educate others, but also be willing to be educated, because once you have the information, then you can formulate to have a true conversation. And again, you may not always agree, but I think when you allow people to at least have a conversation, then you're on your way. It may take a period of time, and things like that. I can't tell you how many times over my lifetime, and actually even most recently, at a particular place that I go to, recreational, and seen a certain gentleman all the time and never spoken. The guy was having an issue regarding a fishing rig. And so I just kind of chimed in and, said my 2 cents. He's like, well, do you know about that? I was like, yeah. I was like, and this is somebody I've seen for the last year, would never speak to. I said, hey, how you doing? Wouldn't speak. And other people told me, how he kind of felt about people of color. And so because I just chimed in particular information, that was the hot button for him. And so now we have continuous conversations around fishing and different things like that. But now that's opened the doorway for us to have other communication and conversations, which we have begun. And so he's starting to open up about his experiences growing up in Louisiana and during segregation and different things like that, and how he felt. So that's just a personal experience that I've had recently. And so had I kept that same frame of mind of like, well, bump it, I'm gonna let him deal with his problem. Otherwise, instead of saying, hey, you might want to try this, that just opened up that door for him to be receptive and say, hey, well, what do you know about that? How do you know about that? I didn't know you knew anything about that. Well, you haven't had a conversation, but now we're on that way. So sometimes it comes in different ways, different forms of fashion, but you always have to be ready. Okay, you always have to be ready to be willing to engage and to educate. I can't overemphasize that enough. And it doesn't have to be long and drawn out. It can be something little simple that has nothing to do with what you really want to talk about, but you'd be surprised at how that will lead to the path of the road to having those conversations, and they're much more receptive.
Gary, you said something that made me touch on, you touched on something that made me think about. So it's not about when you go in and have that conversation that, okay, I got to be right. It's more so you go in with the intent of, I want to understand. Because I think that's really what's important. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's how do we establish understanding? Because there's been many conversations that I've gone into where I saw it from a different perspective, and I felt very strongly about my perspective. But after the conversation, I stepped back and said, my perspective is now changed because I've opened myself up and allowed to consider another perspective, which I saw was a better way.
Great. Thanks for sharing, Willie. And I want to move us on to the next topic, but I think those are some really insightful comments and insightful ways to approach some of these more difficult conversations where there's differences that are there. So let's move on to the learn section, and we'll start that with polling question number 3. Let me switch our slides to that. And hopefully the poll stays up for a little bit longer here. It sounds like there were some technical difficulties on the second poll. So here's poll number 3. What resources do you leverage to learn about diversity and inclusion? A, CFMA. B, other industry associations like AGC. C, human resources or diversity associations. Or D, other. Go ahead and respond to that question when you get a chance. And it looks like at this point in the poll, C seems to be at 36% human resources or diversity associations. 33% say CFMA and 27% say other. 5% say other industry associations. So let's continue here on the discussion around learning, right? Thinking of different perspectives and different viewpoints. How have your own unique life experience shaped your perspective and viewpoints? Let's start with Brittany again for that.
Okay. Obviously, you really look at things throughout your own personal lens. You filter life through your own personal experiences. So when certain things happen to you, you become more sensitive to when they happen to other people. That's just human nature. And so I've been thinking about this a lot lately, kind of the power of empathy and transforming behavior and that kind of stuff. And, you know, very non D&I related, but say you get a flat on your bike, and you're in the middle of nowhere and someone comes over and helps you out. The next time that happens, you bring a spare and you help the next person out. And you're just like, yeah, now I'm very perceptive to that struggle, and I'm going to step in and help with that. So the thing about humans is that we tend to cluster into groups that are like ourselves, and our experiences are similar to those around us. And that's the magic of diversity, is that it broadens our perspectives. It makes life so much richer, and you learn so much more. But you might not necessarily be able to relate to other people because you haven't gone through some of the things, you haven't experienced some of the things that they have. But you know, there's empathy can really transform that. You might not understand the situation that someone's been in, but you might be able to understand the root feeling of what it is. So I might not understand a struggle that you know, Victor's had, but I can understand if it made him feel like shame or sad. Like I can empathize with those feelings and transform my actions to be more proactive in response to them. That makes sense.
Great. Thank you, Brittany. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts, Victor. The first is really, I think all of us have heard of the golden rule, treating someone the way that we want to be treated. There's also a platinum rule, which is treating someone the way that they prefer to be treated. And, you know, I think it's really important to emphasize that an inclusive workplace isn't one where we all feel the same about a particular topic, or that we have the same viewpoint. That's never going to happen. We've all had different experiences. We all have different perspectives. And I think that is what makes a culture truly great, is when you do have that diversity of thoughts. However, an inclusive workplace is one where we can bring our ideas and opinions to the table. We can raise our hands with concerns or issues. And really that contributes to a culture of safety. It contributes to a culture of innovation. And truly that is what we mean whenever we say an inclusive workplace. It's one where, you know, we can voice our opinions or concerns. So we'll talk a little bit more about how this impacts, you know, a corporate culture or how this ties to other metrics like safety or risk management. But this is why we talk about diversity and inclusion, and why we talk about uncomfortable conversations, is you have to create that safety for someone to raise their hand and say that something's not right.
Thank you very much for that, Rachel. Does anyone else have anything to add to that discussion about broadening your perspectives and why that's important? I think those are great. The platinum rule is my favorite.
And I think we've got some great comments in the chat as well. I think we're all, trying to use the attendees' feedback and chat comments within this panel discussion. And I think it is so important to involve your human resources individuals. If you do have some situations that touch on discrimination or harassment, definitely involve them. The reality as well is that you need to equip your leaders and managers to address some of those situations, and to create a culture where someone can raise their hand and say, I'm being harassed or I'm being discriminated against, and have those concerns addressed. Because not everything flows up to the CFO or to human resources. We would like it to be, as a human resources professional, we'd like to be in the loop. That's not the way that it always works. And so you do need to train and equip your leaders to deal with those situations appropriately.
That's great. Thank you for that perspective, Rachel. I know you work in that space and have extensive experience in that space, especially around the risk associated with the discussions that are had in this area. Great. So with that, let's move on to our final section here, which is to lead, right? And how do we build support, and how do we become leaders for our companies in this space around diversity, equity, and inclusion? But before we get to that section, let's go to polling question number 4, and let's see if we can keep this up for a while, so folks have time to answer. And if I'm understanding correctly, to actually answer the polling question, you have to go to the poll section that's on the left side of your screen and go to the poll that way and make your selection. So hopefully Joe can get us going with that in the background, and we can get this question answered. And the question is, what challenges do you face in building support for diversity and inclusion at your company? Different opinions on what D&I means to your company. It's not a top priority for your company. Leaders are resistant to D&I, or other. Let's go ahead and launch into the discussion, and then we'll come back to that poll. I don't think that our discussion is dependent upon the responses here from the audience. So how do you build support for diversity and inclusion, especially when leaders or owners may not be supportive? Let's start with Willie on this one. Go ahead, Willie.
Yeah, thanks, Victor. There are several studies out there that studies and research that show how DEI can benefit your organization. But it's important when starting this conversation is you have to establish that shared understanding of what DEI is. You have to define what the what is, the why, the benefit, and the how. I mean, it is going to be different in different across organizations. But at the end of the day, we have to continue to challenge ourselves it's just more than just meeting metrics. It's not a check box, because if it's just check the box, it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to be of any value. And speaking of value, DEI can't be a priority because priorities change. It has to be a value in your organization. And it has to go beyond just the bottom line, which that is a very compelling argument to say, hey, this impacts the bottom line in a positive manner. And again, research and studies out there show and demonstrate that, but also the retention, because you can focus on diversity, but what are you doing to retain those diverse individuals in your organizations, right? That's where being inclusion comes in, establishing an inclusive environment. And then the equity, right? What are you doing to bridge those gaps? What are you doing to reduce those gaps in the organization where you have people in terms of different levels or different spaces in terms of whether it's within their role, career, access to resources? How do you level the playing field within an organization? All of those are very relevant and very imperative in terms of how you're establishing and defining DEI for your organization.
Great. Thanks, Willie. Brittany, go ahead.
One of the things that Willie said one of the first times and I think Simeon said it too, and maybe all of you guys said it. You guys are also smart. But when we were talking, and you just touched on it just now, Willie, but the people that you attract into your organization is important, but it's also the people who stay. And when I say it like that, I feel like it was Simeon because he really emphasizes words. He was like, it's the people who stay in the organization. That's how you tell. And ever since you said that, I've been really studying our stats and seeing who comes and who's been our longest tenure, who's really comfortable and really involved in the company and who's kind of quiet. And that's been a really interesting exercise because I like to work the room. I like to get to know all the people in our organization. And it's interesting to see people that are really comfortable talking to me, but don't speak up in the rest of the organization. And to me, it's almost a little barometer of, okay, is there something, are we missing something? Are you not engaged? And I think that's the magic about diversity and inclusion is, we tie it to discrimination or race or gender identity, all of these topics. But at the end of the day, it's really making sure that everyone in the organization feels engaged, which is just wonderful. Like the idea that you can have an organization where everyone feels comfortable and safe, like why wouldn't you want that? So I just think it's really cool to meet the people on this panel and listen to what they have to say with the ways that you can figure out that you might have something that you need to work on. I know that's probably not the answer to the question, but I just want to remind everyone that our panelists are pretty cool. So I don't know.
Brittany, you hit the nail right on the head. And I think one of the things I always try to emphasize is, again, over this past year and a half, almost 2 years now, you have a lot of entities, a lot of companies doing a lot of things to attract and to, be engaged from a diversity standpoint. But again, it's about its effectiveness. You got to measure it. Okay. You gotta have objective measurables to see and understand, are you having the true impact that you want to? It's great to have them coming in. And I use an analogy. I had a good friend and he, over a period of time, he would get raises and talk about how much money he's making, but he always stayed broke. Right. So finally time we're having this conversation and finally realized he never balances his checkbook. So while he goes from 50,000 to 100,000 to 150,000, he's always borrowing money. It's like, man, why you got all this money? But he never would inspect what I call inspect what you expect. He never would see what's coming in versus what's going out, right? So you got to understand, you got to measure it, and then you make your adjustments along those lines. And having what I call a true program of, okay, this is our process for attracting diverse talent. Whether it's veterans, whether it's seniors, it's not always black and white. And I think that's the other thing we got to get across. Diversity inclusion isn't about just black and white. There's so many other areas of people being excluded. So a lot of times it's age. A lot of times in my experience early on, I thought somebody didn't deal with me because I was black. Come to find out, it wasn't that. It was because I was college educated, had a lot of technology skill set back at that point in time, and he felt threatened that I was going to implement all these things that was going to move and push him out the way. And when we finally, again, had that ability to communicate and educate, then we were able to collaborate. I was able to build off of his 40 years of experience in the construction industry, coupled with, hey, here's some new, a little bit more efficient ways, not replacing what you do, even though you still want to walk around with a floppy disk. We got thumb drive, we had other ways of doing things, but how we could then partner the resources together, the experience along with the youth technology, and how we both could win, right? But again, that's being receptive to conversation, criticism, or whatever it may be. All this time, I'm feeling like, okay, it's because I'm black. It had nothing to do with that. Come to find out, he had, two diverse son-in-laws and his grandkids. I mean, it's just like, so that had nothing to do with it. But because of my own inhibitions at the point in time of how I had felt over periods of time, I had built in a defense mechanism and assumed the wrong thing. We finally have a conversation and it wasn't even about that. And so because we communicated, educate each other, then we're able to formulate a plan, all right, and put together things. So I think, again, it holters back to that. And how do you, as Willie said, how do you implement those things now that you've attracted them, you've got them in, whatever that inclusion mechanism may be. Now, how do you make that from an equitable standpoint? And again, providing that access so that everybody feels welcome, everybody feels like their point matters, they're contributing to the masses. That's when you really got, a culture, because you want to make it a culture, not just actions, but it's a culture. This is who we are as a business. We're inclusive, we're diverse, okay? Everybody has equal opportunity to be successful and has access to the resources to achieve their goals. To me, it's plain and simple. I don't understand who wouldn't want that. Who wouldn't want that?
Simeon, I love the message that you're sending in this, grounding ourselves and understanding our commonalities, right? So that we can explore our differences, right? Not that those differences are meant to be divisive, but let's have conversations and say, hey, we're both fathers, right? We're the same in that way. But how is my fatherhood different than your fatherhood based on whatever you want to put out there, race, gender, whatever that might be? So certainly something to think about of how we come together so that we can have these discussions in a better way to make people feel more welcome, right? So I want to feed off of some of the things that are happening and discussions that have been had in the chat. I want to dive a little bit deeper into this whole, is it okay to talk about race in the workplace? Why is it important to have discussions about race or other things in the DE&I space in the workplace? Willie, do you want to talk about that a little bit more at the next level?
Yeah. So I think this is probably one of the most uncomfortable conversations that people talk about having in the workplace is about race. Some people feel as though, well, it's divisive. It shouldn't be talked about because of the liability organizations can have. So you look across your organization and you see that, okay, my organization is pretty diverse, right? Well, you know what? I'm sorry. Let me back up. An individual came to me one time and said, hey, Willie, I don't understand what DEI is. I want to help you. I want to be an advocate, but I don't understand it. All I care about is if the person next to me can perform, they'll show up at work, and they'll do a good job. I don't see color. I just want to hire the best person for the job. And my response was, same here. But guess what? Everyone else doesn't think that way. People do judge people based upon the way they look, how they identify, their faith, the way they talk, the way they sound. Hell, even whatever college they attended or sports team that they support. People have these biases that negatively impact individuals. So that's why you have to talk about it, because it's just not a bunch of people being sensitive and making these things up and saying, hey, this is a problem. It's a problem because it exists, right? So it is necessary. You take the summer of 20, where you had, and I'm just going to pick the polarizing, what's going on in the African-American community, along with the pandemic and George Floyd and the other murders that happened that summer. You just think about people in your organization, people of color in your organization, what they were feeling, and not having that outlet to talk to, I want to talk to my supervisors, say, I'm really struggling with this. Because again, we just can't check our emotions at the door anymore. We talk about, wellness, work-life balance. Well, the stuff that happens outside the door, that follows a person 24/7. It just does. And as leaders, we have to be able to put ourselves in a position to be there for our associates, be there for our employees. That is necessary. And my advice when people say, well, I just don't want to do that, well, then you probably shouldn't be a leader, because leading is tough. You got to be there. You got to be there for your people. I don't care who they are or what they look like. You got to be there for them, because that's what they expect you to do. And saying that race should not be discussed at work, please try to consider why it should not be discussed at work, or why it should be discussed at work. Think about the impacts that your associates have. Because like everyone else, they're going to say, I wonder what my supervisor feels about what's going on in this community. They're going to want to know that. And let's just say you're thinking like, well, what if I have a different opinion than they do? But you know what? That's okay. As we said a moment ago, it's not about where you have to agree. It's about listening to different perspectives to gain understanding. And then at the end of the day, we hope people choose the right thing to do.
Yeah, to what, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you know, the way that people disagree on things seems to have changed so much, and we aren't used to, if you and I hold a different opinion, sometimes it's just like a cage fight. And when all we need to do is listen. And so I think one thing that, you know, in some organizations that I've watched or been a part of, people don't want to broach a difficult conversation. It's kind of like that snowball thing, because we know the people are genuinely kind people or good people, but they said something that's inappropriate. And to call them on that seems very, because of the way that we view conflict, it feels very pointed or very adversarial. And that's where those, again, I keep harping on the rules of engagement, but I just love them. As long as you have those and it's a foundation of your communication, you can have a productive conversation. And you can say, it's not because I think you're a racist. It's not, I'm not throwing you out with the bathwater. I want to understand, and I want to see where you're coming from. And I would like, you know, we just need to understand each other and see if we can move in the right direction, because it's just, so many people are so afraid to be disagreed with, and that's just going to happen. There's everyone, that's the whole point of this. There's diversity in our diversity. Everyone is different, and it's wonderful. And you just need to understand how to respect that. So I don't know.
Brittany, I think you touched on an important theme, and I think it's something that we see in our society. And sadly, really, it seems to be very related to our politics and how polarizing they seem to be right now. How do you talk to folks about diversity and inclusion who find D&I and politics to be one and the same, right? How do you have discussions with folks who equate these discussions with being political?
For me, it's a common value of respect. You know, inclusion really ties to that fundamental need to be respected, to feel like you belong. And I'm going to work through an example with you. You know, construction companies focus a lot on risk management, on workplace safety. I mean, those are key metrics that you use. So let's use an example. Let's say you have an employee, female employee. Maggie is going to join your organization. She's going to join the construction crew. If she looks around your crew, is she going to see herself represented? Probably not. Less than 1% of the construction workforce is female. So when she looks around, she's probably going to see a lot of men. And let's say her first couple of weeks on the job, she heard a lot of jokes at her expense. Let's say that there was a lot of innuendo, you know, some dirty jokes, maybe something like that. According to a recent engineering news record or ENR survey, 66% of women in construction have faced sexual harassment or gender bias in the workplace. So also incredibly common. So now, let's say that she puts on some PPE. She's going to be compliant with her safety protocols. So She is likely going to be wearing PPE that's fitted for the average man, 180 pounds, 6 foot tall. Will it fit Maggie? Probably not. She's probably going to be swimming in that PPE, right? So based off of her experience on the first couple of weeks on the job, do you think she's going to raise her hand and ask her supervisor for PPE that fits her? Probably not. She's probably going to try to do the best that she can with the equipment that she's given. So this is why we talk about psychological safety. We talk about inclusion. We talk about the importance of having uncomfortable conversations. It matters on your workplace. It matters when people don't feel safe to raise their hand and voice a concern. It has very, very direct implications for your risk management strategies and for your safety protocols. And moreover, I was doing a little bit of research as well. Based off of 2018 stats from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, deaths for Black and Hispanic or Latino workers in construction have actually been increasing. And that is based off a variety of different factors. But a lot of it comes down to that communication. It comes down to safety. It comes down to being able to raise your hand and say that something's not right. And so when we talk about diversity and inclusion, it doesn't have to be divisive. It doesn't have to be related to politics. It means that you can come, you can show up, you can be yourself, you can feel accepted, you can have a workplace free of harassment or discrimination, and that when you see that something isn't right, you can tell someone and have your voice respected and heard. And so when we talk about diversity and inclusion, a lot of this is just core values, human values. And I think if you can tie more of that to those core human values, you can make that message resonate a little bit more.
That's amazing. Thank you, Rachel. So with that, I think it's time to transition to some of these amazing questions that are coming up. I'll start with a question from David. So David's an outside consultant. He's not actually with the construction firm, but as that consultant, he would like to broach the topic of DE&I, thinking about pulling in different statistics, an employee census, and really thinking about how his clients can start tracking KPIs in this space. Are there any suggestions that this group has for him as he considers trying to broach this subject with his clients?
Well, going back to the approach that I was mentioning earlier, every organization is going to have a different approach to DEI based upon the business, right? Based upon its mission and based upon whether they want to focus on retention, they want to focus on revenue. So given the industry that he's in, there's plenty of studies that talk about how having diverse workforce, promotes innovation. It has a better bottom line than your less diverse peers. So it's just defining what DEI is to that organization. And then based upon that foundation, then you talk about, okay, now how can we apply this to our organization's mission? Because at the end of the day, regardless of what industry it's in, it's the right thing to do. Is the way of continuing to strive to be better, right? But organizations like to tie actions to their mission, and they like the results to be revenue generated. So you just have to define what that is, what the why and the how is, and then apply it to your business.
And just to piggyback on that to David's CPA specific question. I'm not a CPA, but what I did for our organization, I'm kind of a like low key data person, and I used our EEO1 report, and then I looked at the census from 2020 and the projected population, and so I looked at the stats for our organization versus the state of North Dakota. That's where I'm from, and then the whole aggregate U.S. And all I see is how not in line we are with the state of the population. And so to me, I'm like, that's a thing we need to work on, because right now there's a ton of candidates out there that aren't working at our organization. And I don't know why, but let's get after them. Let's make it so we at least match or, match the population. So that's an easy, depending on the size of your company or the company that you're consulting with, those stats are already pulled annually for federal work. So the EEO1 report, I think it's called, and then just comparing it to the census, which is publicly available and free.
Yeah, it almost becomes a business imperative the way that you spell it out, Brittany, right? It really is, to continue to think about the future of your business and the alignment to the population of where our country and our society is actually moving towards. So, Willie, I think you answered this question in the chat, but I think it's worth bringing up. And we talked about it in our last session, and it's around the term equity, right? Getting those definitions of D, E, and I, right? The E in that is equity. Can we talk about what the definition of equity is, and how you measure equity, if that's possible?
Yeah, so I'll just summarize what I put in the chat, but equity is acknowledging the gaps that you have in an organization of people being at different levels, and knowing that there are people at different levels that are receiving an advantage versus the individuals that aren't at that level and not having access to the same resources. If you can picture a graphic where you have three individuals looking over a fence, you have a short, a mid-size, and then a tall person trying to view over the fence. The tall person can see over the fence fine, but then you had a second person who can't, then you have the third person. Well, if you look at equality, you don't give them the same size boxes, the same height boxes to where they can see over the fence. Well, the tall person was already seeing over the fence, so they can still see. The middle person can now see over the fence, but that shorter person still can't, because we gave them equal height boxes, right? But when you look at equality, it's giving them the resources they need in order to bring them up to the rest of the individuals in the organization. So that's going to vary based upon the individual needs. So that's really the basic fundamental of understanding equity, is acknowledging those gaps in the organization and then identifying ways to bring people up to the same level so everyone can be on the same playing field, on a level playing field.
Great. That's great, Willie. And again, there's more of a definition, and we talk about that a little bit more in the last session we did during the CFMA National Conference. Again, the link to that should be in the resources section of the media player that we're in right now. So I want to get to two more questions. We don't have much time left, but let me go ahead and start with the first one here. What are your top recommendations to educate employees regarding DE&I in order to start the conversation? Should we start small, as in movies, literature, or small groups? Or should the change start at the top of your organization, or both? Who would like to take that one on?
I can take it. I mean, if you're starting that journey, I would make sure that you have good harassment and discrimination training in place. I would also look at, I saw a question related to unconscious bias is often referred to as self-awareness training of understanding yourself, understanding your communication preferences, understanding your own journey and perspectives, and how that shapes your view on situations. And so unconscious bias is also called implicit bias, or self-awareness training is a great place to start a conversation. We are going to be as part of our CFMA Diversity and Inclusion Committee, creating a toolkit or creating a list of resources for you to access and to leverage within your organizations. Some of those might be prepackaged training for you. Others might be, resources that you can kind of plug and play and use to facilitate discussions within your organizations as well.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. Go ahead, Willie.
Leadership buy-in. It has to be supported from the top, or it's not going anywhere. You can have the best intent, you can have the best passion, but if leadership is not supported, you're just spinning your wheels. It's going to turn into check the box, window dressing, and it's just not going to go in. It's not going to go anywhere. Start with the leadership. That is imperative in order for your DEI program to be successful in your organization.
Right. Simeon?
Yeah, one of the things I always say is compliance versus commitment. Are you doing it? Are you just doing something to be compliant, to stay out of trouble, to keep certain people happy, whoever that may be? Are you committed? And when you're committed, you're going to invest the time and the resources, as I said earlier before, to have a true program, which is sustaining. And that goes with education and training and execution. And again, that becomes infectious, and that becomes part of your company culture, just like safety. Okay, for those of us in the construction industry, I'm sure that's probably the top thing that out of all the core values, but I'm sure safety is one of them, right? Because we all want our employees, our subcontractors, everybody to go home the same way they came to work. That's first and foremost. We exude a lot of training and education into safety. Same thing with DE&I. Okay, if safety is part of your culture, then inclusion, equity, all of that is culturalistic. And again, you put in mechanisms to make sure people are safe, and we train and we have certifications. Same thing. It's about investing. Okay. A lot of times people say, well, it costs this or that to have these things for DE&I. What does it cost you not to have it? Okay. Again, if you start measuring and you start measuring objectively certain things, you will start to see in some form or fashion that it's a cost not to, versus investing in it and having a predicted or a desirable outcome that you want to have. Because anytime you have to be responsive or compliance, you probably didn't plan for that, right? So that means that's a cost that was not budgeted or whatever that may be. The resources were not originally allocated. You got to do it now because you want to stay out of trouble. You want to avoid these punitive damages, liquidated damages, or whatever it may be. But when you're able to be proactive and you plan for it, you have a desired outcome and you can steer your way. If you get a little bump off the road, you got a roadmap of how to get back on and how to keep consistent. It's not easy. It's not perfect. But when you strive for perfection, that road and that path becomes easier. Watch and see when you have people that feel welcomed. Again, I think I said this during our first deal. You have people that will come to work on time. Matter of fact, come to work early. Don't mind staying late. Don't mind traveling. Don't mind doing other things outside of that when you feel a part of the process. But if you don't, then they're going to be compliant. I'm going to give you 8 to 5. That's what I'm paid for, right? Because you don't pay me to do other things outside of that. You don't pay me to stay late. You don't pay me to do this or that or whatever. And so you'll see a change of attitude. You see a change of mindsets, collaboration, and then watch and see the impact of the bottom line. But again, it's over time. It doesn't happen overnight. And you have to instill that to have a true culture internally.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing that Simeon just brought up. Construction safety is first and foremost, always physical safety. And I was reading a book lately, and it brought up the concept of psychological safety in work, which comes as a result of inclusion and engagement and feeling comfortable and safe. Construction has a pretty poor track record with D&I. We're working on it. And we also have a pretty poor track record with mental health stuff. And that is just kind of is, to me, a sign that we've underinvested in psychological safety. We put physical safety at the forefront, but we need to treat psychological safety the exact same way, because people will be engaged. And I mean, I'm sure the CFMA does a ton about suicide prevention, but it's a pandemic in our industry as well. And so addressing that mental health needs to be cared for as much as physical health is a thing that our industry just doesn't need to be, we just need to be proactive about it. And I think these things are really important in changing that.
Let DEI be a value to your organization, not a priority, because priorities change. And facilitate when you're going to discuss DEI. Don't let something happen to where, oh crap, we got to talk about this because something happened. Be proactive and talk about it, because maybe that's one thing could be the difference between something happening in an organization that is polarizing, you're on the front page, versus just having a hard conversation and establishing a DEI program within your organization.
Great, Willie. And Brittany, Simeon, Rachel, thank you all so much for the amazing conversation. I think we could probably go on for like a full day in this discussion, but we have to cut it off here. We're already a couple minutes over. So folks, thank you for joining us today. Again, keep an eye out for that November, December Building Profits article around our rules of engagement. And we'll also be at the AGC CFMA conference, your CFMA DE&I committee. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.